This week's Torah portion, Parshas Nasso, has some amazing, amazing ideas. One of the things that it talks about is the unfaithful wife. If a person suspects that his wife is having relationships with other people, so he warns her not to be secluded with another man, just in her and another man. And if he has a witnesses that she was secluded with another man, then even though he doesn't know if she had a relationship with him, he takes this woman to the high court in Jerusalem, and they give her a special concoction to drink. And if she's guilty, she blows up, she explodes. And if she's innocent, she has a easier child rearing, and having easier pregnancies, easier life. So basically, she's definitely wrong for putting yourself under suspicion, right? A woman should not go ahead and seclude herself with other men in suspicious types of atmospheres, in situations. So she definitely is sort of guilty of that, and guilty of her husband suspecting her. And therefore, he has the right to take her to the court. And there's a special thing, they actually write God's name on a paper. They put that paper into a certain liquid, and it dissolves in there, and then they give her to drink that. If she's guilty, she blows up, she dies. And if she's innocent, she has a better life. That is the story, or so to say, of the unfaithful wife. The Torah uses the word kisisteth. If she goes against her husband, so to say, right, that she's secluding herself. And the rabbis explain that people only do things wrong when they have like a wind of foolishness in them. They get like a craze of a desire for something, and they lose their senses. It's very hard for people when they lose their senses to control themselves. So therefore, how would someone go ahead and do an act that's immoral? Is they lose their sense. They're not in their thinking moment, their thinking mind, and they're doing actions sort of just acting without thinking. So one of the keys for a person to become successful in life and overcome his evil inclination and not do things wrong is to prepare. It's preemptive measures. Don't put yourself in situations where those situations that you're going to be in will cause you to make mistakes. Don't go ahead and put yourself in a circumstance that you're going to be enticed or challenged to sin. Avoid sinful opportunities. Avoid situations which will cause stress. For instance, let's say there's certain people that you don't get along with. So avoid their company until you're able to find a way to get along with them, which is something you should always do. Avoid those people, because if those people are around, it's going to cause stress. Avoid circumstances with your spouse or with your children that will cause discord, will cause friction, right? Until you have a way how to deal with it properly. Avoid places, or avoid watching things, right? Or avoid being involved in things that will cause you perhaps to sin. And the same is the other way around. If you want to be successful, right? So if you go ahead and you put yourself in the right place, you'll be a lot more successful. If a guy wants to pray properly, so he can pray at home, he can pray in the synagogue. Putting yourself in the synagogue most likely will enable you to daven better, pray better. So put yourself in the position to do the right thing. A big key of actually doing right or wrong is being in the right setting to do the right thing and avoiding the wrong setting, and therefore it won't bring you to doing the wrong thing. And the Torah notes like this, an interesting thing. We're talking about the unfaithful wife. So the Torah tells us that the preceding verses talk about giving the gifts you're supposed to give to the Kohen. Leon's a Kohen. A Kohen does service in the temple. And for his service, the rest of the Jewish people give him certain gifts. Gifts of animals that they slaughter, gifts of tithing that they give. So the Torah says if you don't bring your tithes, your proper gifts to the Kohen, in the end you have to bring your unfaithful wife to the Kohen. Because the Kohen was the one that facilitated this whole procedure with the unfaithful wife. So this is a very important lesson. A lot of times a person doesn't realize when they specifically do something against the Torah, let's say, they think they can get away with it. Says the Torah, if you're not going to go to the Kohen and give the tithe to the Kohen, you're going to end up having to go for a much worse reason. You're going to end up having to go and bring your unfaithful wife there. It catches up to you, so to say. And I heard a beautiful story to the contrary, how someone really had the recognition and the value of using an opportunity to give and not to take. There was a very righteous individual who unfortunately became ill and needed a surgical procedure that would cost him $5,000. Okay. So what happened was the Bikur Cholim, the organization that helps out people that have illnesses, took upon themselves to actually pay the $5,000. So this guy who thought he had to pay the $5,000, he didn't have to pay it, right? He was able to keep that money in a savings account. He was very, very grateful. So what did he do? Like any other good Jew would do, he took out $100, he wrote a $100 check, and he gave it to a person who collects charity to give it to the big rabbi, Rabbi, to distribute to the charity. After an hour, the same man who went through this procedure, he returned to the charity collector with another check. And this check was for $4,900. So the charity collector, $4,900, that's like, first of all, it's an odd number, that's an enormous amount of money. So he tells him, listen, I just had a procedure. I was committed to give $5,000 for the procedure. And I had a great, a great gift from heaven that the Bikur Cholim organization that helps the people that are ill paid for it. So I decided to give $100 to charity. But then when I told my wife, I said, what do you mean? Give the $4,900. So here I am with the other $4,900, total of $5,000, and I want you to give it to the rabbi to distribute. And the rabbi heard about it, he said, I want to meet this couple. Such special people, I want to meet them. See, so here they had an opportunity to save the money, but they gave it anyways. They gave it to charity. I had a number of those circumstances over Pesach where I got money from other people. It was given to me, and I didn't need it. And I was able to distribute to other people because people need money for Yontif, and I was able to do it, and I was so thankful that it worked out. That I already had the money that I needed. I was able to give it to other people. Really, really an amazing thing. Okay, now what happens when somebody sees this unfaithful wife? You see the whole thing. You watch this lady blow up. You watch the terrible, episode and experience of going through this whole thing, bring the woman to the Kohen, the whole 9 yards. So the Torah tells you, if a person witnesses that, you know what they should do? They should be careful and make themselves into a Nazir. What is a Nazir? A Nazirite is a person who commits himself with a vow not to drink any wine for a certain amount of time, and not to make himself, defile himself going to a cemetery with, people that are impure, and as well not to cut his hair. 3 things: don't cut your hair, don't drink wine or anything to do with grape products, and as well the 3rd thing is not to become impure with dead bodies, impure in any way. So the Torah says, if you witness this scene of immorality, of a woman who is immoral, be careful, abstain from wine, so you shouldn't get yourself in a situation where you could perhaps get drunk, and stay away. Separate yourself, take yourself back a step, so you don't get close to that. Now there's a very interesting question here. Let's imagine, God forbid, you were driving on the highway and you saw a terrible, terrible crash. An extremely terrible crash, a fatal crash. Most likely, your response would be to be more careful the next time you drive. You wouldn't need to go at a driving course. You would get the message. Be careful when you drive. You saw it firsthand. So why, after you see this lady and you see her punishment, right? As a side note, actually, the husband as well, the person that she lived with that did that immoral act also dies. They both die. But why, after seeing this terrible act, would you have to go ahead and start abstaining from wine? Just the mere lesson itself, seeing the punishment and the tragedy should be enough to abstain. Usually when you see the result of a bad action, that itself is the greatest lesson not to do that. So why over here does the Torah tell you, no, I want you to abstain more? And there's a very interesting concept. Is what we experience in our lives has an impression on us, for good and for bad. Even when you see somebody doing something that's evil and wrong, and you know it's wrong, but the mere fact that you were exposed to it makes an impression on you that this actually was done. And even if you see the punishment, you still might say, you know what, it was done, and maybe I'll do a better job. The thief always thinks about not the guy who got caught. He thinks about how he'll be different than the guy who got caught. But the more he sees people steal, the more he thinks that this is a good way of life. So it's something hidden inside of us. Even though, you're right, your initial reaction might be, let me abstain from anything that I've seen that was evil or bad. But inside of you, it makes an impression that this actually, people do it. You see the story, you hear a story, a wild story in the news. So you think in the beginning, like, wow, how could this ever happen? But as you hear a few more stories, people do this. This is actually people, I didn't know this became the norm, or this became something that the people are doing. And it makes an impression on you. And for that subtle impression, a person should go the other way and take a step back and abstain. We live in a society that's full of elements that are lowering the standard of morality all the time, in so many ways. And we're not even in tune to it because we just live. We were part of the life. We just go and go and go. We don't even realize it. And we really have to take note about just because people have standards that are getting lower doesn't mean we should lower ourselves. To the contrary, we should go the other direction, not to be influenced by that. We should be more aware, make more boundaries to recognize not to be immoral. You have to go the other direction a little bit, not to make sure you don't slip, because it becomes so natural, the world around you. And I'll tell you a fascinating episode with the Chafetz Chaim, the great rabbi who wrote the great books about laws of speech, the laws of, lashon hara, forbidden speech and gossip. He lived in a town called Radin. His whole life, he never witnessed the desecration of Shabbos. His town was all religious, a very small town. He never witnessed desecration of Shabbos. When he was in his 70s, mid-70s, it was during World War I. And the entire population of his little village, Radin, picked up and moved into the interior of Russia for the duration of the war. So they moved. And that was the first Shabbos, his first Shabbos in exile. The Chafetz Chaim in his entire life witnessed Jews desecrating Shabbos. And the sight made him break down, and he cried. He cried over it. It bothered him so much, he cried. He never witnessed his whole life. Imagine 70 years, you never witnessed desecration of Shabbos. We're so far from that. Guess what happened? The next week, again, unfortunately, the same thing, and he cried even more. And they asked him, Rabbi, why are you crying more than you cried the first week? You should cry less. So the first week, he said, I cried of the pain of people desecrating Shabbos. I saw that, it bothered me so much. But this week, I'm crying for myself. I'm crying because it already made an impression on me that people don't keep Shabbos. And it didn't bother me the same way, like it used to. I became used to it to some level. And now I'm crying more for myself that I myself got to a level of being complacent of people desecrating Shabbos. And that's why I'm crying now even more. So he was crying for his own level that he felt was minimized a little bit by the mere fact of one Shabbos being used to people desecrating Shabbos. He was over 75 years old. I'm sure he wasn't being, enticed or having the challenge of desecrating Shabbos. But it bothered him so much that he himself got used to this concept a little more. So if that, Chafetz Chaim, some great rabbi, 75 years old, that's how he took it. He cried over it. We really should take note of this concept and make an effort in any direction of our life that we see other people or the throngs of the world becoming more used to this, whatever it is, to take a step back and sort of, distance ourselves from that. Listen, social distancing has some benefits of sort of recognizing you don't have to be like everybody else. You have your own place, your own distance, and that's who you could be. Another idea about this, to add to this, really to add, I think this is very amazing to add. That's what we're talking about when you see somebody else's sins. What happens about your own sin, right? Somebody else's sin, we just said, okay, distance yourself. What about the sins you make yourself? Your own sins you make. Rabbi explains, it's a phenomenal idea, that we all make mistakes. How should you refrain from your own mistakes, right? We're talking about in this Torah portion refraining from somebody else's mistakes. But you should use the same lesson to refrain from your own mistakes. When you see you slipped in a certain area, let's say you thought you wanted to do this right and you messed it up. So put yourself in, like I was telling you in the beginning, put yourself in a position not to fall. Take the same lessons that you would take when somebody else's sins to yourself when you make a sin. Take those lessons, say, you know what, if I fell down over here, let me move 2 steps backwards so it doesn't happen again. Like I was telling you in the beginning, put yourself out of that position where you don't have that challenge anymore. I'll tell you one little parable they say, this is the classic example they give. There was a guy who was a terrible drunkard. Literally night after night, the guy wasted and he would get drunk and stone drunk, and it was terrible. And his son was so embarrassed by it. So one day the son got hold of the father, and he really, he leveled him down, no drinking, and the father was good. And then he takes his father with him, and he goes out to the bar, and he shows his father all the guys lying there stone drunk and how ridiculous they look, how low they look. And he says, this is what a drunkard is. And the father looks for a moment or two, and the son thinks like he's taking it all in, And then after a couple moments, the father goes over to the drunk guy on the floor and he says, whispers in his ear, he tells him, tell him, my friend, where did you purchase this powerful whiskey that tastes so good? So even though, for a moment or two, he was able to recognize the issue, but his desire, when he saw the drunkard, was right away, where do you get that whiskey from? And we all have an element of that, where that desire, so to say, of where did you get that whiskey from? You got to really, really take a step back and try to avoid those situations. Okay. One more powerful lesson about the Nazir. So the Nazir is the guy, right, who after he sees this episode, and really anybody could do it, he makes himself a higher level Jew. They try on their own to commit themselves to abstain from wine, abstain from cutting their hair, and from, touching a dead body. So the Torah says that after you finish that completion, and after you finish the entire process, it's somewhat of a sin if you don't keep it up. How is it like that? The Ramban actually explains. He says that when the Nazir finishes his entire process, a 30-day process, or however many days you commit yourself to this lifestyle, he has to bring a sin offering. And the Ramban explains the reason you bring the sin offering is because now you're going to go down a level. You were on a level that you abstained, you reached a certain plateau, and now going down is sort of, sinning in a way, because you're not going to be able to keep up that powerful element of where you were. So a person, when they gain a certain level of spirituality, let's say over a holiday, over a Shabbos, you come, you feel exuberant, you had a great holiday, you feel inspired. So you got to make sure that you keep part of that up. You got to continue that. This Nazir, who made commitments to his life for a certain period of time, when he's done, he can't just fall right back into it. He has to keep up that commitment. And that's a very powerful lesson, to be able to keep up the commitment that you had. That's the lesson of the Nazir. Okay, Leon, this is for you. In this week's Torah portion, it talks about the blessings of the Kohen. Right, the Kohen's blessings that we get from the Kohen themselves on the holidays, the high holidays, all the holidays, the Kohen's bless us. As a matter of fact, when you're in Israel, the Kohen's do the blessing every single day. Leon, if you ever move there, every day you have the blessings. So there's a fascinating thing about the blessings. The blessings, it says, right, the Kohanim actually give the blessings, but the Jewish people said, we don't want the Kohen's blessing. We want God's blessings. So Hashem said, I will instruct the Kohanim to give you my blessing. So the Kohanim, the Kohen, the priests, are giving over God's blessing to the people. It's through the Kohen, but it's God's blessing. What is so powerful about God's blessing? The most important thing about God's blessing is God knows what's best for a person. God knows what's really a blessing. That's the idea. There's a concept that a thief who prays, God listens to him. And he'll help the guy steal. That's a very foolish thing to do. The guy is asking God to help him be successful. So God will listen to him because he's prayed sincerely, but it's a very purposeless place to put your prayers. Very foolish place to put your prayers. So we want God's blessing. The best way to pray is say, God, I don't know what's best for me. Please give me what's best for me and enable me to be able to have the recognition this is best for me. At least I should try to understand why this is best for me. It makes it easier. There was a guy who was making ends meet, just barely, scraping by. And he lived in Europe way back in the times of the Chavetz Chaim. And he prayed and he prayed and he prayed that he should win the lottery. Lo and behold, one year he won 20,000 ruble. Became somewhat of a wealthy man. And after a couple of years, he did a bunch of investments that did not work out. He lost all the money and he didn't even have his original job. And he was so broken. And he came to the Chavetz Chaim. And the Chavetz Chaim said, I can't really help you. He said, you prayed to God with all your heart you should win the lottery. And you asked for all your money that you're supposed to get over 5 years, you asked it to come in 1 year. So God gave it to you in that year because you prayed so badly for it. But then you wasted it. You lost the money. And now God gave you what he was planning to give you. So you're in a bad place. So you're going ahead and you're asking for a blessing of something that you think is good, but it's not necessarily good for you. A person should always have the attitude that Hashem knows what's best for him. So I try to always pray, Hashem, please enable me to do your will as best as possible. Please give me the ability, the interest, the desire to do your will. You pray to Hashem to give you the desire to do your will and the resources to do your will. Right? Hashem, give me whatever I need so I can do your will. Give me the money I need, the energy I need, to be intelligent enough, to understand what I should be doing and how I should do it, and not to do it correctly, not wrong. All that. That's what I try to pray for. And I'll tell you a very, very powerful concept. I'm with this with a little story. Yaakov, our forefather, he gave Joseph the city of Shechem, and he said it was done through my sword and my bow. The Targum Unclis explains the bow means prayer. It's a form of prayer. And he says that when you shoot an arrow from a bow, you miss a lot, right? It's very hard. The accuracy is much harder, especially if you don't have a direct target. It's not as accurate. There's the wind element. You could blow it. But when you shoot many, many arrows, eventually you hit the target. Prayer is like a bow and arrow. You pray, and you pray, and you pray. And it could be the first prayer and the 10th prayer God heard, but that wasn't enough for God to see your desire to have that work out for you. You should continue praying. There's never enough prayer. It's like a bow and arrow until eventually you hit the target and God gives you. The Shimshon Pincus was a big, big rabbi who had a tremendous heart. His books are known as Nefesh Shimshon, the soul of Shimshon. He was a great, great man. He had a very high level soul and a very special man. And he said in all his life, whenever he prayed to God adamantly, God always fulfilled his will. Okay? He said many, many times in his life, he prayed to God adamantly. Every single time, God fulfilled his will. But then he said it wasn't always the right thing to do. And he told over a tragic story. He had a very good friend who had to reclaim a car that was in Cyprus. And it was very important that this friend had the car. He was involved in outreach. He needed a car. It was important. And Reb Shimshon Pincus had to go to get the car for his friend. And when he got there, he forgot to bring the appropriate documents. So it's a big pain to go back, and his friend really needed the car. He lived a couple hours away. So he prayed adamantly to God. God should somehow allow him to get the car without the papers. And he came up with an idea. Yeah, he had some papers written in English, and he puts the English documents on the desk in front of the officer. And the officer asked him what they were. What are these papers? So Shimshon said to the officer, you don't know what these mean? You can't read this? The officer was embarrassed. He couldn't read English. And he was, oh, yeah, you can take the car. Everything is good. Because he was so embarrassed that he couldn't read English. Amazing. And Pinchas got the car in a miracle fashion. Unfortunately, the very first ride that friend took of that car, got into a car accident and he died. Had Pinchas not prayed, most likely the officer would not have given him the car. And the chain of events of this friend being in the car accident would have happened. So he prayed and God listened to his prayer, but it was the wrong thing. So it's most important to always recognize to pray whatever the best thing is for me. God, you know what's best for me. Give me that ability to do it, to know it, to understand it, and see it. So Leon, when we make the Kohen's blessing and you're blessing the people, you should think about that God's blessing, should come through you. That whatever the people need, they should get. The words of the blessing, right? What are the famous words of the blessing? Hashem should bless us and guard us, watch us. Hashem should shine upon us his chen, his a good countenance, his expression of just fondness to us, right? His face to us, glowing to us. Should give us peace. Very general terms we talk about, not specific. Because for every individual, what does blessing mean? What does it mean to be guarded? What does it mean to have, find favor in God? So what does it mean to be fond, God should be fond of you? What does it mean you should have peace? All those are different for every individual. And therefore, the blessings are very general. And that's what you should have in mind when you go ahead and you do that.